have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I will be reading from the July 22nd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: OpenAI said 2 AI systems it was testing broke out of their test environment, hacked their way onto the internet, and broke into another company. OpenAI named David Velez, founder and global chief executive of Nubank, a Latin American digital services firm, and Robin Vince, the chief executive of Bank of New York Mellon, as directors. Major U.S. stock indexes rallied, with the S&P 500, NASDAQ, and Dow rising 0.9%, 1.3%, and 0.7% respectively. Novo Nordisk escalated the weight loss competition, suing Eli Lilly for allegedly using deceptive advertising. Novartis returned to sales growth in the second quarter as revenue from key drugs helped to offset patent expirations. Disney agreed to serve Kraft Heinz products at its North American properties and will permit the food company to use Disney characters on some goods in stores. Fenway Sports Group, owner of the Boston Red Sox, is in talks to sell a minority stake in Britain's Liverpool Football Club. Northrop Grumman raised its guidance on the back of steady global demand, fueled by military spending. Utz Brands agreed to be taken private by German salty snack maker Intersnack Group at an enterprise value of about $2.9 billion. Hasbro raised its full-year outlook after swinging to a profit and logging higher revenue for the second quarter. 3M increased its full-year targets for earnings and revenue as the conglomerate recorded higher sales in safety and electronics. Now for the key articles under the worldwide section. With its deadly attacks on an airbase in Jordan, Iran proved that it retains a significant missile and drone arsenal that still threatens U.S. forces and Washington's regional allies, despite Trump's claim to have destroyed Tehran's military. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth estimated the latest cost of the Iran war was $37.5 billion, some $9 billion higher than earlier figures provided by the Pentagon. An American manufacturer will, for the first time, begin producing drone boats designed and battle-tested by Ukraine as the Pentagon seeks to expand its arsenal of autonomous weapons. Trump is preparing to reshape the legal justification for his tariff regime this week and push negotiations with North American partners into high gear. The Trump administration plans to accelerate its overhaul of federal research by supporting more individual scientists and the use of AI rather than universities. The Trump administration froze more than $1 billion in Medicaid funding to California and Minnesota, a fraction of what those states receive for the program. Mayor Zoran Mandani said New York City doesn't have the authority to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, but he urged the federal government to carry out the International Criminal Court's warrant for the Israeli leader. New Jersey removed thousands of non-U.S. citizens from its voter rolls, blaming a software error for the registration of the individuals. French lawmakers approved a bill banning children under 15 from using social media, marking a first for the European Union. The picture on today's front page shows a man looking up at someone holding the Ukrainian flag. And that caption reads, "Bowing to protest, Zelensky ousts Army Chief." The caption, "People Power." President Volodymyr Zelensky dismissed General Alexander Syrsky on Tuesday as head of Ukraine's armed forces. Protesters have thronged Kyiv in the wake of Zelensky's removal of Mikhailo Fedorov, the tech-savvy defense minister who criticized Syrsky for being too slow to adapt his methods to avoid bloody battles against a more powerful foe. The article, Zelensky in Reversal, Fires Military Chief. New commander in Ukraine's war has praised the ousted defense minister, by Anastasia Malenko. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky fired the country's armed forces chief in a major reversal after initially siding with General Alexander Syrsky in a controversy with a young defense minister closely associated with Ukraine's growing prowess in drone warfare. The Ukrainian leader announced his abrupt shift Tuesday evening following days of street rallies after he removed Mikhailo Fedorov as defense minister last week. After several meetings with senior military commanders, Zelensky replaced Syrsky with another experienced officer, Major General Mikhailo Derpaty, who previously signaled his willingness to take a more innovative approach to breaking the deadlock on the battlefield. It could prove a pivotal moment in Ukraine's 4-year-long defense since Moscow's full-scale invasion. Syrsky led the initial effort to protect Kyiv in February 2022. He later planned a counteroffensive that gained a broad expanse of territory in the east. After Zelensky promoted him to commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Syrsky oversaw Ukraine's invasion of Russia's Kursk province, the first time a country had invaded Russian territory since World War II. But in recent months, Syrsky became entangled in a worsening conflict with the tech-savvy Fedorov, whom Zelensky appointed defense minister in January, and who quickly drew acclaim for the success of Ukraine's expanding drone campaign, which is reaching deeper into Russia to hit a wider range of economic and military targets. After Zelensky sided with Syrsky, removing Fedorov from his post last week, Fedorov accused Sersky of being too slow to adapt to attempts to streamline and modernize the armed forces. At one point, Fedorov said the general had told Zelensky that one of them would have to go. Sersky has denied doing so, but the manner of Fedorov's departure sparked a wave of demonstrations, with thousands taking to the streets in protest and leaving Zelensky dealing with a political crisis. The incoming Armed Forces Chief, Deprati, is well regarded by many other officers, first capturing public attention in 2014 when he was among the Ukrainian soldiers fending off assaults by Russian-backed forces in the east of the country. Deprati has publicly praised Fedorov. Other articles from the front page follow. Tehran's missile barrage shows U.S. hasn't erased lethal threat. Iran flaunts deadly ability despite Trump claiming its military was totally destroyed. By David S. Cloud in Washington, D.C., and Annette Palad and Milan Chersny in Tel Aviv. With deadly attacks on an airbase in Jordan, Iran has proved it retains a significant missile and drone arsenal that still threatens U.S. forces and its regional allies, despite President Trump's claim to have totally destroyed Iran's military. The strike on Mufafat Salti Air Base on Friday that killed 3 U.S. service members was likely carried out by Tehran's most effective missiles, including the Khaibar Shekin mid-range system, military analysts said. That missile system and others were housed in vast underground facilities that the U.S. and Israel spent weeks pounding in March and April. Since then, Iran has dug out the openings and resumed firing from some of the bases, some analysts said. That underscored the continuing challenge the U.S. is facing. More than a week after resuming airstrikes against Iran, it has been unable to quell Tehran's ability to strike back. U.S. forces struck military targets in Iran Tuesday night, marking the 11th consecutive night of attacks, U.S. Central Command said. The Pentagon confirmed a 3rd soldier was killed in the Jordan attack. Sergeant Angel Rampersad, 28, of Ozone Park, New York, was listed as missing before. Iran's attack was its 4th in 5 days on U.S. troops in Jordan, an indication that Tehran hasn't exhausted its missile stocks and might have become better at evading U.S. air defense systems, some analysts said. For Iran, the goal is to raise the cost to the U.S. of prolonging the conflict, hoping Trump will back away from his threats to escalate the war once again and renegotiate a settlement that leaves Tehran in control of the Strait of Hormuz. That missiles were able to slip through U.S. air defenses points to the challenges in protecting the estimated 50,000 troops stationed in the region, even though Iran is shooting fewer missiles in its salvos than it did earlier in the war. Meanwhile, waves of heavy bombers and Tomahawk cruise missiles were used to attack tunnel openings at the sites, entombing the Iranian weapons below ground in some places. Iran has used the ceasefire to rebuild. The missiles fired at Jordan likely came from a base near the city of Tabriz or other bases in western Iran that have resumed operations, said Nicole Grajewski, an expert on Iranian strategy at Sciences Po in Paris. It means that Iran was able to replenish its missiles or maybe dig out some of the ones that were in the bases, and they clearly still have some of their more efficient missiles, she said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. President prepares new tack in tariff campaign. Reshaping of levies legal backing after court ruling tees up more uncertainty. By Gavin Bade and Matt Grossman, Washington. President Trump is preparing to reshape the legal justification for his tariff regime this week and push negotiations with North American trading partners into high gear, setting off a new phase of trade uncertainty for businesses after months of relative calm. When the Supreme Court in February struck down most of Trump's second-term tariffs, he immediately replaced the illegal duties with a temporary 10% tariff that applied to nearly all U.S. imports. That 10% duty is legally limited to 150 days, which ends early Friday. The interim period ushered in relative stability in trade policy as officials crafted a new set of levies to replace it, a welcome relief for trade-reliant firms buffeted by constant policy shifts over the past year. The calm is ending. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said on CNBC on Tuesday that he expects new tariff action soon, previewing replacement tariffs for the ones that expire Friday. And a day earlier, Trump said he would impose additional 50% tariffs on certain goods from Canada, a move that pressures the U.S. northern neighbor to renegotiate the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. The Canada tariffs were separate from the sweeping global levies that Trump is trying to rebuild after the Supreme Court ruling. We're 3 days out from the page being turned, said Drew DeLong, a former State Department official now at consulting firm Kearney. Many companies have been kind of lulled to sleep on the tariff front for the last 5 months, he said. After the Supreme Court said Trump overstepped his authority last year by using a 1970s emergency law to impose levies, the president's trade team is expected to impose duties under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Those are widely seen as more legally durable, but trade observers expect that overall U.S. tariff rates won't change much in the short term under the new legal regime. In crafting the replacement tariffs, administration officials have said they would devise levies at similar levels to the expiring levies. How London's planning rules keep housing unaffordable. Home construction is nearing a standstill thanks to regulation, increased building cost, and politics. It's strangling the city. By Natasha Dangour. London. Shoreditch Works is the kind of real estate project big cities say they need. It aims to revitalize a rundown block in East London, delivering about 80 new homes, retail space for several thousand workers, a green tech incubator, and new pedestrian lanes and public space. Developers have spent 4 years trying to convince authorities to approve their plan. submitting more than 9,000 pages in documentation. Local planning officers denied the bid earlier this year, saying it lacked detail. The UK capital is at a crisis point. Home construction is nearing a standstill thanks to a toxic mix of Byzantine regulations, increased building cost, high interest rates, and politics. London has an official annual target of 88,000 new homes. It broke ground on just 4,170 housing units in 2024 to 25, according to data from the Center for Policy Studies, a center-right think tank. During that period, the population grew by around 100,000. Even among older cities in industrialized nations, where it's often hard to find the space to build, London stands out. It would need to build 1.1 million more homes to reach the Western European average of homes per capita, according to the CBS. The failure to build doesn't just hold consequences for the livability of a city. It has knockout effects that can distort the economy, politics, and social mobility. The capital city, one of the few bright spots in the UK economy, is dimming under the strain. When buying a house sight unseen comes with 3 dead bodies. By Kate King. Burlington, Connecticut. Edward Marchand took a chance when he bought a 4-bedroom house in this affluent suburb without stepping inside. When he entered for the first time, he could hardly believe what he found: 3 dead bodies. Connecticut State Police described the bodies found at the foreclosed home as skeletal remains and identified one of them as the previous co-owner, Sally Ann Cash, who would be 54 years old today. Another body belonged to her son, Brian Cash, who would have turned 23 this month. The third body is undergoing DNA testing to determine its identity, according to the Connecticut Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. Sally Ann Cash purchased the house in 2019 with her husband. Marchand won the house in June at a sight unseen foreclosure auction, meaning bidders weren't able to tour inside beforehand. Marchand's winning bid was $525,000, seemingly a bargain for a property valued at $650,000 in one of the country's hottest housing markets. "I don't know if I'd want the house after that," said Michael Najami, who lives about half a mile away. The lawyer appointed by the court to oversee the foreclosure auction, Christopher Thog-Martin, said he assumed most bidders planned to flip the home for resale. Marchand declined to comment. It is still not clear when or how the house's former owner and her son died, but police said they believe the deaths were an isolated incident. The mystery is an extreme example of what home buyers can encounter when purchasing houses through foreclosure auctions. Most house hunters wouldn't dare buy a home sight unseen, but at auctions, bidders are rarely given a peek inside beforehand. A locomotive named Big Boy is making grown men cry. World's largest operating steam locomotive is on its first coast-to-coast tour. by Esther Fung, Altoona, Pennsylvania. This summer's tearjerker isn't a rom-com. It's Big Boy 4014. The 1.2 million pound locomotive, built in 1941 to haul heavy freight across the Wasatch Mountains between Utah and Wyoming, is traveling east of the Mississippi on its first coast-to-coast tour. At every stop, grown men are welling up, said Ed Dickens, Union Pacific Chief Locomotive Engineer for Big Boy. AI hikes building cost. The spending binge for AI data centers is helping to mask some of the weakness in traditional categories of commercial and industrial construction. Spending on new factories, warehouses, and other non-AI industrial sites has been held back by rising cost. U.S. manufacturer to build sea drones used by Ukraine. Deal to make the battle-tested boats could kick off wider sharing of weaponry. By Shelby Holliday and Alistair McDonald. An American manufacturer will, for the first time, begin producing drone boats designed and battle-tested by Ukraine as the Pentagon seeks to expand its arsenal of autonomous weapons. The deal has been struck as the U.S. begins to use sea drones in combat. American drone boats attacked an Iranian submarine and ship facility at a naval base located on the Strait of Hormuz earlier this month in a kamikaze mission. The manufacturing deal also comes as the U.S. and Ukraine move to increase sharing of weaponry. President Trump recently said he would consider allowing Ukraine to manufacture American Patriot missile interceptors, which the U.S. has drained in the Middle East and which Ukraine needs to counter Russian attacks. A longer-term White House-sponsored attempt to access Ukrainian technology and expertise has moved slowly. The drone boats, known as Maguras, will be manufactured by Portland, Oregon-based Recon Craft, which makes boats for Special Operations Forces. Administration freezes Medicaid funds by Liz Esley White. The Trump administration is freezing more than $1 billion in Medicaid funding to California and Minnesota. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Administrator Mehmet Oz said Tuesday that the freeze is part of an effort to prevent Medicaid fraud. The two states, both led by Democratic governors, can access the funds, the officials said, if they provide documentation for some claims the health department has flagged as suspicious. If Governor Gavin Newsom or Governor Tim Walz wants this funding released, all they have to do is provide basic documentation showing that these services are legitimate and not fraudulent, Kennedy said. Walz of Minnesota and representatives for California's Newsom said the administration was targeting the states for political reasons. Militaries vie for more cotton to make ammo by Suni Engel Rasmussen, Bergerac, France. War planners today need deep reserves of drones, computing power, and cotton. NATO doesn't have enough For all the digital wizardry emerging in the war zones, armed combat still relies on explosive power, much of which comes from the same plants used to make t-shirts and bed sheets. Nitrocellulose, also known as gun cotton, is the indispensable chemical material in virtually all modern ammunition systems. Highly flammable, when treated with acid, it acts as a propellant, triggering a violent explosion of gas needed to launch artillery up to 70 miles. Gun cotton has historically been made from what are called linters, the short, fuzzy fibers left on cotton seeds after the main fibers are removed. And limited supplies are one of the biggest hurdles NATO faces as it seeks to build up ammunition stores to counter the growing might of Russia and China. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Mandani can't arrest Netanyahu, but he recklessly raises tensions by keeping this baddie idea alive. Zoran Mandani repeatedly pledged that if elected mayor, he'd order the New York Police Department to arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on sight. This was a foolish and impossible promise by a candidate practicing meme politics. Yet Mr. Mandani apparently isn't ready to admit this, since it would disappoint the anti-Israel leftists he hyped up last year. In 2 months, New York will host the United Nations General Assembly. So is he getting the cell block at Rikers Island ready for an incoming VIP? Last week, Mr. Mandani was asked on the Interview podcast what to expect if Mr. Netanyahu attends. The mayor tried to deflect, calling the Israeli leader a war criminal, and then saying something vague about following the laws of New York. The host pressed that she didn't understand what that meant. Whatever the law allows me to do in New York City, that's what we will do. But we won't be writing our own laws to that end, Mr. Mandani said. Okay, but what does the law let him do? That's an active conversation with our legal department, he replied. However, what we've seen at the national level is a desire sometimes to write your own laws, to go outside of the bounds of legality. That's not something we have an interest in. Well, that's big of him. Don't doubt the sincerity of his desire to see Mr. Netanyahu in handcuffs, or his willingness to cede U.S. sovereignty and put the NYPD at the command of the International Criminal Court. This is the mayor's worldview. The U.S. isn't subject to the ICC's jurisdiction, but if it sought to indict American troops for some alleged conduct abroad, Mr. Mandani would probably go along with that too. With Mr. Netanyahu, the mayor insists New York will do whatever the law allows, which is bupkis, nothing. Foreign policy is for the federal government, not freelancing mayors. A 2002 law broadly prohibits U.S. cooperation with the ICC. Heads of state visiting the U.S. are under protection of the Secret Service. Does Mr. Mandani imagine that when Mr. Netanyahu's motorcade leaves the UN, the NYPD can pull it over on First Avenue? The idea is preposterous. But what a reckless thing for the mayor of New York to suggest. Rather than acknowledge he sold progressive voters a batty idea that he can't deliver, Mr. Mandani is raising the tension and stirring up globalize the Intifada agitators. Will they resort to the streets in protest once they discover that the mayor's pledge was little more than left-wing wish casting? Trump target acquired. Pickaxe Mountain. Iran's only remaining major nuclear facility is now in the president's sights. President Trump's attention has turned to Pickaxe Mountain, the deep underground potential nuclear enrichment site, long familiar to readers of these columns. We'll be hitting that area pretty soon, the president said Tuesday. There's not a thing they can do about it. Let's hope he's right on both accounts. The U.S. passed over the facility during Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025 and this year's Operation Epic Fury. At the time, sources said the facility was either too deeply buried, 330 to 475 feet beneath a mountain, or not important enough. The latter was short-sighted, as the journal's report on the transfer of centrifuges to Pickaxe Mountain makes clear. We don't have it on record, Mr. Trump commented on the report, but maybe this one they have right. Iran has already been caught continuing construction at Pickaxe Mountain. The president said the presence of centrifuges doesn't mean anything unless they have the nuclear material. But with centrifuges at a difficult-to-hit location where activity goes unmonitored, Iran could restart nuclear enrichment. You don't build a facility like the one at Pickaxe Mountain merely to store centrifuges. This is the enrichment site of the Iranian regime's dreams, the perfect place for a nuclear breakout to weapons-grade uranium. It's deeper even than the Fordow site that the U.S. struck with precisely targeted 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators. Hence the need for U.S. action. Mr. Trump has justified his interventions in Iran as aimed at stopping the nuclear program. It's a worthy goal he has done much to accomplish, as none of his predecessors would. But it would make no sense to do so only to leave the regime an ace in the hole with no reasonable guarantee of inspections. The technical question of how much U.S. bombs could achieve is important. But even if the facility can't be destroyed, it still would be worthwhile to set it back or block access to the site. Given the core objective in play, the president would also be justified in taking a risk to launch a special forces operation. The same applies for Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. This goes to the heart of what the U.S. is still trying to do in Iran. Central Command has attacked for 10 consecutive nights, striking some 1,000 targets. No doubt, this has softened up the Iranian presence near the Strait of Hormuz, but Iran is still able to strike commercial vessels, and traffic is depressed. More pounding is unlikely to bend the regime's will, but neither will the 10-day reprieve the mediators and reportedly Tehran are pushing. That resolves nothing when Iran still intends to conquer the strait and rebuild its nuclear program. As Mr. Trump said Tuesday, until they're ready to meet in a meaningful way, we have no interest. That leaves the real options: walk away, leaving what remains of the nuclear program intact and ceding the strait to Iranian extortion, or take decisive action to open the strait and further debilitate the nuclear program. If Pickaxe Mountain has come to the fore for Mr. Trump, it's indicative of the larger strategic choice that awaits his decision. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages: Long live the EV. Now that the U.S. isn't killing it with help, the electric vehicle has a chance. By Holman W. Jenkins, Jr. In fewer than 800 words, I can tell you what went wrong with the U.S. electric vehicle transition. Let's start by correcting misrepresentations in vastly longer accounts produced elsewhere. The U.S. Big Three have seen their domestic market share shrink. Yes, but due to foreign-owned auto plants established in the U.S. on terms that exempt them from the high-cost labor monopoly of the United Auto Workers. The Big Three voluntarily ceded the sedan market and focused on pickups and large SUVs, which have been shielded from import competition by a 25% tariff since 1964, the only part of the U.S. car market to be so shielded. Electric vehicles haven't been compelling to U.S. consumers and producers for an obvious reason: a relatively low domestic gasoline price. Failing to tax something isn't the same as subsidizing it. But still, economists and auto executives have said for 50 years that the U.S. government should adopt a gasoline tax if it wants to create incentives for high-mileage vehicles. Instead, we got Ruby Goldberg fuel economy mandates. After the 2009 bailout, Team Obama tweaked the rules further to facilitate sales of profitable pickups while tacking on an effective requirement to sell EVs at loss-making prices, even when thousands of dollars in direct taxpayer subsidies were added to the pot. In a recent lament, the New York Times waves at unnamed many experts to say this was a sensible way to foster an EV industry. It wasn't. Real experts with actual names at AlixPartners and McKinsey predicted the result would be what the former called a multi-billion-dollar pileup of money-losing EVs. Sure enough, companies are reporting big write-downs. $19.5 billion for Ford last year, which critics insinuate is somehow the Trump administration's fault for ending the EV mandate. Wrong. The losses were always present and going to be recognized. Now there will be fewer. If anything, Mr. Trump's method of ending the mandate by reducing to zero the penalties for noncompliance was mildly redundant. Automakers were already skipping compliance and opting to pay financial penalties under the EV rules. Building a new kind of product, after all, requires billions in investment in new plants, new engineering, new or retrained workers, for a product that companies had seen no signal from the public that it wanted. All this was additionally wrong-headed because, in the process, It encouraged exactly the wrong kind of EVs, large, luxurious vehicles that can command a luxury premium from consumers to defray manufacturer losses, often $50,000 per vehicle, but whose large batteries provide the least net emissions benefit, if any. Underlying this goofy experiment, decades of op-eds and political speeches demanding that fossil fuel companies invest in renewables, an obvious category error that somehow became the basis for U.S. policy. Don't think op-eds don't have influence. This at a time when investors around the world were voluntarily investing in the lithium-ion battery revolution, including in transportation. Tesla perversely had to battle its way against domestic incentives that required traditional car companies to dump EVs on consumers at a loss. Tesla, which actually wanted to make EVs, was a net loser under U.S. EV policy. Now it has been overtaken globally by China's BYD, which began as a battery company. The cars Americans want must come from somewhere. Companies with expertise in gasoline vehicles. The U.S. no longer has a national EV incentive program. This doesn't mean it won't have EVs, including from traditional car makers, if they see a profit opportunity. Out one side of her mouth, CEO Mary Barra once proclaimed GM's all-electric future. Out the other, she winked at shareholders to recognize the enduring profitability of its gas-powered pickup and SUVs. But GM isn't giving up on EVs now that it's free to pursue them in a way that makes sense for shareholders. To complete the record of futility, the U.S. itself is rapidly becoming a rounding error in global emissions, and passenger car use worldwide always was. The much bemoaned failure of America's EV transition is only the end of a policy that polluted the U.S. market with uneconomic, nonsensical EVs. Which brings us full circle. Dozens of columns here since 2008 described or alluded to the moment, which received hardly a peep of dissent elsewhere in the media, when an incoming Obama administration dropped any idea of fossil energy taxes in favor of climate pork. For 20 years, this policy wrong turn proceeded in full view of a press whose deference to a narrative precluded it from saying and or perhaps even seeing the truth. This is a real problem. It starts at the top of U.S. media firms and explains why a transparent folly like the EV boondoggle was allowed to go on for so long. A British psychiatrist debunks an American racial myth. Theodore Dalrymple's account of England's white underclass will sound familiar to Americans. By Jason L. Riley. The idea that today's racial disparities stem primarily from America's history of slavery and segregation deserves far more scrutiny than it typically receives in discussions about Black upward mobility. It's a narrative advanced by politicians and activists to secure votes and financial support, but facts and logic point in a different direction. Racism has been the constant in Black American history, yet Black progress has fluctuated. And better race relations haven't necessarily coincided with faster social and economic advancement. 100 years after the end of slavery, black nuclear families were the norm, and most black children were raised in a home with a mother and father present. Today, neither is true. In the 1940s and 1950s, rates of black arrest and incarceration were significantly lower than today, and black incomes and years of education rose at a faster clip than among whites. Harvard's Robert Putnam notes that before the late 1960s, the gap in high school and college completion between white and black students had been narrowing. But after 1970, that catch up progress drastically slowed in the case of high school and actually ended in the case of college. Today, he adds, black Americans are completing college at a lower rate compared to whites than they were in 1970. The same patterns, significant improvement in the first two-thirds of the 20th century, followed by less improvement or even retrogression in later periods, can likewise be detected in black labor force participation, incomes, and home ownership rates. According to the Pew Research Center, the black-white disparity in family income in 2018 was approximately where it was in 1968. Mr. Putnam notes that gains in black home ownership, which improved significantly between 1930 and 1970, later stalled. By 2017, black-white inequality in home ownership was as high as it had been in 1950. Academics and commentators of a certain ideological bent invariably blame all remaining social and economic inequities on slavery, Jim Crow, and current racism. But is that a plausible explanation? Racial discrimination has by no means been vanquished from the U.S., and no decent person wants to see race relations return to what they were 70 years ago. But what reasonable person believes that racial bias is a bigger obstacle to black advancement today than it was during Jim Crow? Are educators, employers, lenders, and law enforcement personnel more racist in 2026 than they were in Bull Connor's day? According to the 2020 census, more than 9 million black people earn incomes above the white median. If white supremacy still carries the day in the U.S., as many on the political left insist, how is that Americans of Chinese, Japanese, and Indian descent have higher median incomes than whites? The racism explains everything line of argument ignores or plays down cultural factors that are far more likely to be driving social inequality, as evidenced by the fact that non-black populations in the U.S. and abroad with no history of slavery or segregation exhibit many of the same characteristics of the black underclass in America. Vice President J.D. Vance's insightful 2016 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, describes all manner of white social dysfunction in Appalachia. Another text worth your time is Life at the Bottom, a 2001 collection of essays by Theodore Dalrymple, the pen name of Anthony Daniels, who worked as a psychiatrist and physician in a British slum and nearby prison. Anyone familiar with the antisocial behavior that characterizes so many black ghettos in the U.S.? The drug use, promiscuity, domestic abuse, violent crime, aversion to education, will recognize the world Dr. Dalrymple chronicles. The difference is that he's describing the UK's white underclass. I cannot recall meeting a 16-year-old white from the public housing estates that are near my hospital who could multiply 9 by 7. I do not exaggerate, he writes. Even 3 by 7 often defeats them. Dr. Dalrymple is sharing anecdotes, but hard data supports his observations. According to The Economist, white 16-year-olds in one London borough had worse test scores than do black 16-year-olds in any London borough. Nationally, poor whites fare worse at school than poor blacks or Asians. The book's essays demonstrated that the social problems of America were not primarily racial in origin, in the sense that the black population was disproportionately disposed to them because of either inherent defect or the historical injustice they had undoubtedly suffered, but because of the culture and mores that a proportion of that population now espoused. Dr. Dalrymple writes in a preface to a new edition of his book, "What I observed in England was a breakdown similar to that in these poor black neighborhoods in America, but the population was white rather than black, and therefore race had nothing to do with it." There's an article about the World Cup titled, "With a Red Card in Final, Fernandez Became Villain of the World Cup," by Joshua Robinson. The 6-week World Cup produced dozens of heroes, including a 40-year-old goalkeeper, a pony-tailed Viking, and a trash-talking Mexican coach. But as the tournament reached its conclusion on Sunday evening, the soccer universe came to a rare consensus. There was only one villain, and he played for Argentina. In a space of a week, Enzo Fernandez managed the exceptional feat of all, at once alienating millions of people from around the globe, including his own nation. He doomed his team by being sent off in the World Cup final, and he enraged his club by looking to leave. And most damning of all, he disappointed Lionel Messi. Newspapers in Argentina panned his performance. One newspaper in England dubbed him a World Cup brat. As much as he helped get his team through to the final with that wonderful goal against England, he's cost his country. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 22nd, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day or evening.